Kingdom of Heaven, Ridley Scott's big-budget film set during the Crusades. But is this movie historically accurate? Find out today on Real Crusades History as we dissect Kingdom of Heaven and determine what in it is truly reflective of history and what is pure fiction. Hi, welcome to Real Crusades History. I'm J. Stephen Roberts, and today we are going to figure out what's historically accurate in Kingdom of Heaven and what isn't. To help me in this task, I'm very glad to have two of my favorite academics with me today, Dr. Helena Schroeder and Paul Copenhagen, both of whom have incredibly impressive backgrounds in the study of medieval history, in particular the Crusades. So very pleased to have both of you with me. Helena, how are you doing today?
Very good, thank you. Glad to be here.
Excellent. Thanks so much for being here. And Paul, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day, and I'm glad to be here.
Outstanding. Really great to have you here. So let's jump right into our dissection of Kingdom of Heaven. So the movie begins with some introductory text flashing on the screen in a rather dramatic fashion. And that text says, "It is almost 100 years since Christian armies from Europe seized Jerusalem. Europe suffers in the grip of repression and poverty. Peasants and lords alike flee to the Holy Land in search of fortune and salvation. One knight returns home in search of his son." This opening text seems to be attempting to establish a long-running theme in Kingdom of Heaven. Europe is backward and poor, while the Islamic world is wealthy and progressive. However, for this time setting, the 12th century, Western Europe and the Islamic world were essentially at equal levels, economically and culturally. In fact, Europe was in the midst of a flowering of culture and civilization, the 12th century Renaissance. The sentence, "Europe suffers in the grip of repression and poverty," is particularly absurd. Were European peasants more oppressed than Asian peasants? Poverty was no more widespread in Western Europe at this time than it was in the Orient. We have to remember, too, that while some Latins did make plans to permanently settle in the Crusader states, most of them simply traveled there as pilgrims to visit the holy sites, then returned home.
Yes, certainly. I think the thing we've got to keep in mind is that peasants in Western Europe were not more oppressed than peasants and slaves, because you got to remember the Muslim states were all slave-owning societies in the East. In fact, we have a contemporary report from a Muslim traveler from Granada, Ibn Jubayr, who traveled to the Kingdom of Jerusalem in April 1183, and he reported that the Muslim peasants he saw in Galilee were more prosperous and content than those living under Islamic rule outside the Kingdom of Jerusalem. As for levels of economic development, we should keep in mind that in certain areas, notably in agriculture, transportation, especially shipping, by the way, and weaponry, the West was decidedly more advanced than the East by the 12th century. It was the introduction of modern agricultural techniques by Western settlers that enabled the Crusader states to undergo what Professor Malcolm Barber described as an agricultural revolution. Those innovations introduced in the Holy Land in the 12th century had developed in Europe, of course, much earlier in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, with the result that common people, peasants, ate better in Europe than anywhere else on earth in that by the 12th century. Professor Rodney Stark claims that the medieval Europeans may have been the first human group whose genetic potential was not badly stunted by a poor diet, with the result that they were on average bigger, healthier, and more energetic than ordinary people elsewhere. This is certainly borne out by frequent references in Arab texts to how large and powerful the Farangi, or the Franks, were. And there's some pretty dramatic, examples of this. So I think it was King Baldwin the First hacking off a camel's head or something with one stroke of his sword. Anyways, the innovations that may sound primitive to us now were, in fact, techniques way ahead of what were being used in the Middle East at the period. So I just want to name a few of these. There's the three-field system of cultivation, which allowed 2 crops on 1 field each year. There were plow harnesses for horses that enabled the use of draft horses for plowing, a significant improvement over human or oxen power, which is still used in the East, and by the way, still here in Ethiopia. There were horseshoes that increased the traction horses had, enabling them both serve as draft horses and as fighting platforms for men. The swivel axle and brakes for wheels, the later 2 innovations, when combined, enabled the Europeans of the 12th century to use wagons for transport at a time when the Arabs and Turks were still dependent on pack animals. So although Westerners Although that sounds very simple to us, the fact of the matter is all of these innovations contradict that initial statement that, what was the quote? That Europe was in the grip of repression and poverty. And what was it also? Peasants, had to flee to the Holy Land to find prosperity. Just the reverse, the West was very prosperous. And I would also mention that although Westerners were not leaving to escape oppression and poverty, recent scholarship does demonstrate that there were as many as 140,000 Latin settlers in the Kingdom of Jerusalem by 1180, and that's nearly 1/4 of the population. And the bulk of those settlers were not lords or knights, but tradesmen, craftsmen, and free peasants. Half of them settled in rural communities, but half of them also living in cities, and they were all of them freemen, not serfs. Of course, you are correct to say that, however, the vast majority of travelers to the Holy Land were pilgrims who went to the sites to pray at the churches and then returned home.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning that in the 12th century, as you said, we had the beginnings of the 12th century Renaissance, but we want to make sure that we also discuss the intellectual and cultural improvements. Literature, culture was blooming. With the Christianization of the Magyars, which became the Hungarians, and the Scandinavian tribes, also known as the Vikings, this brings about a more or less settled countryside and really ends the last of the migratory raiding groups that would have produced a stunted sort of culture in the West. But we also see the rise of universities. Oxford, Paris, Toulouse, and many of the great universities that we know today, they're starting to be chartered at this point in time. We see the rise of Romance writing in this era, an overall rise in education. Included in this rise was also the rise of the town, which exists outside of the typical feudal structure. Towns had to be chartered by the king, and they were usually led by prominent citizens of the community rather than paying fealty to a noble and then on up the feudal chain. Although ostensibly they kind of paid their homage to noble landowners as the military force that would defend the town in case of need, they were typically pretty independent. So with the towns, we see the emerging middle class. We begin to see merchants and these tradesmen that wind up going to the Holy Land. It's also during the 12th century that Henry II of England completely rewrites the common law. He creates a trial by jury, local circuit courts. He establishes the yeomanry, ordering that men in the countryside be armed. The reformation of law in England, which was easily the most backward of the Western powers in terms of centralization and organization, is tremendous. Paul Brand does an excellent job detailing the changes of the law under Richard I's father. And what we have by the late 12th century is a society with greater food production, greater access to learning, proliferation of wealth, justice, and even the bearing of arms to create rights for the common peasant. This is not a Christendom in the grips of poverty and destruction on the verge of ruin. This is a vibrant Europe riding the innovation of learned men to new heights of education, and even by this point they're surpassing the glory of Rome, which is something they always seem to be reaching back to, especially with titles such as Holy Roman Emperor. Court of Louis VII, which is in France, which is where this movie is supposed to take place, was even more sophisticated, if less centralized, due to the shaky fealty and succession of various French nobles who would wind up pledging to the English crown or the French crown based on various forms of inheritance.
This whole opening sequence continues to try and establish this image of 12th century Europe as bleak and despairing. The movie opens with this scene which shows Balian's wife being buried. Balian's wife, we're told, has committed suicide because she had a child that died. Now, I don't know, this sort of strikes me as the element more to a modern story than a medieval one. Pretty much every medieval woman had a child that died, and certainly she would have grieved, but suicide strikes me as a bit more of a modern response. And personally, I have never read a medieval account of a woman killing herself because her child died. Not saying it definitely could not have happened, it just seems to be more something Scott is pulling out of the modern world, especially when you consider how deeply medieval Europeans held their Christian beliefs. Suicide was a mortal sin, and medieval people tended to be very focused on the afterlife, so That seems like something that would have really run counter to the way a medieval person thought. I don't know. What do you think, Helena?
I think you're certainly right to say that it was much more a part of life and people learned to cope with it. And I once wrote an essay on medieval families that points out how rare it was for a child to be raised by both natural parents, because in the course of their life, probably one or the other parent would die and they would end up being raised by stepfathers, stepmothers, and living with half-siblings. Nevertheless, we have some dramatic evidence of intense grief on the part of parents when they experience the loss of a child. So I don't think we should dismiss this as impossible.
So at the end of this scene, the priest says that they have to cut off Balian's wife's head because she was a suicide. Is this accurate? Was this actually done?
I honestly don't know. Certainly suicide was a mortal sin, particularly horrible because the victim inherently had no chance to repent and receive absolution. Maybe Paul knows something here. What do you think, Paul?
It's definitely not at all accurate, nor were they buried at a crossroads. There would have been a common potter's field that would be a non-sanctified graveyard. This is where non-Christians and Christians who had committed suicide, etc., alike, would be buried. It is true that as a Christian, she could not receive a Christian burial in holy ground for the commitment of this mortal sin, but mutilation of the corpse would actually be a further desecration. Even today, the Catholic Church holds a more or less strict prohibition on anything that would destroy the body, like cremation after death. It's still very odd for a Catholic, for example, to be cremated. She would be buried probably without ceremony, without blessing. The same would happen to any non-Christian. I think for purposes of Hollywood, this is the setup to make Balian even angrier with the priest later on. Balian can't be mad at the priest for his wife's suicide and the state of her salvation or burial in the eyes of the church, but he can be murderously angry at the priest for desecrating the body and then stealing the necklace later. So this is pure Hollywood fiction designed to give Balian his reason for running away.
Okay, so next we see a shot of Godfrey of Ibelin, a fictional character invented for this movie, arriving in this little French village with his entourage of crusaders, newly returned from the Holy Land. This entire scene shows an image of 12th century feudal life in Western Europe that is entirely too shabby and impoverished. Peasants weren't living in absolute rubbish conditions at this time. Villages were more developed at this period.
Agreed. I mean, that's what I mentioned earlier, that Western European peasants were enjoying the highest standard of living ever known on any place in the globe at that point.
Okay, during this same scene, a bishop makes the comment, "There is so much done in Christendom of which Christ would be incapable." Again, this seems a bit like a modern imposition on the medieval world, especially because the bishop says a law can go too far, implying that the laws of the church at this time were not Christian. An opinion that I don't think many bishops would have held in this era. What do you think, Helena?
Actually, I think this echoes Dostoevsky and his Grand Inquisitor. But nevertheless, we should not forget that this was also a period in which the Catholic movement was gaining strength and spreading. And there was then a reaction of St. Dominic, and not very long after that comes St. Francis of Assisi. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The Catholic Church in the 12th century had a monopoly on religion, and this resulted in many church offices being treated like they were nothing more than power bases and sources of income by those who could obtain them. So the corruption of high church officials, bishops, abbots, etc., did arouse outrage, and it did foster a lot of these new movements, as I say, Dominic trying to respond to the Cathars by creating inside the church an organization which was focused on poverty and living by the tenets of the church. What do you think about that, Paul?
There's certainly abuses, and in fact, this is not long after the investiture controversy hits Europe. Thomas Becket, arguably the poster child for the controversy, was martyred in 1170. He was a man who was put into power by a king so that the church could abuse its power under the crown, and then he turns into a faithful servant of the church under the Pope and became such an inconvenience that we get the famous phrase from Henry II, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And followed shortly thereafter by poor St. Thomas's martyrdom. The abuses in the period are many, and are even largely perpetrated in the name of the church via the king's authority. We see the same sort of thing later in the early 15th century when a church trial composed entirely of English and allied Burgundian clergymen try and sentence Joan of Arc. The church and the political sphere often overlap here. So with Dr. Schrader, I think the sentiment is well in place at this point. It hasn't yet reached the rife abuses of the Reformation, but it is certainly in its period of ramping up.
Okay, next the movie takes us into a castle which belongs to Godfrey of Ibelin's brother, where a banquet is being held in the middle of the night to welcome Godfrey home from crusade. The scene inside the castle also seems too shabby. The interior of a medieval castle's great hall was brilliantly painted, colorful banners, etc. Hollywood seems to always portray medieval castles as looking like they look now, old and in ruins, rather than bright and new as they would have looked when they were newly built. Godfrey's brother is shown as a belching simpleton who mocks Saladin's rise. More of Scott's insistence on portraying Westerners as buffoons. Godfrey's brother's hair is unkempt and messy, which also strikes me as wrong. Noblemen took pride in their appearance, especially their hair.
Unfortunately, this image is so ingrained in people's minds that I had a running fight with a reader of one of my blogs, when I quoted an early 13th century document that described the splendor of John de Ibelin's house in Beirut, which she insisted was utterly inconceivable in the West, and then cited the kingdom of heaven as their evidence. So we have here an example of how powerful Hollywood is, that people take, a movie over what a legitimate primary source from the 12th century. Anyways, I have to say in this scene, obviously, because it's set in the dark, there's no real opportunity to show the richness of the colors that would have made up the decorations. But, you're getting back to, yes, they certainly would have had rich colored hangings, they would have had beautifully colored clothes, and the noblemen certainly bathed frequently and took pride in their appearance. So much so that the church complained about it, by the way. So, overall, this portrayal is, as you say, as inaccurate as the portrayal of the peasant village.
Absolutely. And this is, as we said, another example of the thematic Hollywood style of the medieval world. Tapestries were brilliantly dyed between silk and wool and linen. There's plenty of color. It was a sign of wealth to have these garments dyed. There's certainly a style piece here, and it's entirely inaccurate to history.
Okay, in the next scene, we're taken back outside into the village where we are introduced to the hero of the movie, a heavily fictionalized Balian of Ibelin. Balian is a blacksmith in this movie, and in this scene he is working in his shop. There is a sort of mentally challenged looking boy accompanying Balian in his work. He's always got drool running down his face or snot hanging out of his nose. Again, this is here solely to portray the West as backward. Physically and mentally deficient people existed in both West and East, but of course Scott shows one in the West. Also, outside of Balian's shop, some peasants are shown here wearing basically brown rags. As Lindy Bage said in one of his videos, Hollywood seems to think that in the Middle Ages, all peasants walked around in filthy, dirty rags. Again, this is absurd. Medieval peasants did not look unkempt all the time.
Yep. And with the more nutritious food, as you say, comes the bigger person. We have legends of giants, which are far more prevalent in Northern Europe than anywhere else. It's because regularly the average Roman, for example, might have topped out around 5'2", but the average Scandinavian regularly reached about 6 foot. Also of note, the mentally handicapped would likely have been handed over to the care of a monastery. If there was some sort of mental deficiency of the boy, Balian would not have taken him on as an apprentice, but rather it would have turned him over to the care of monks or nuns who basically provided all of the hospital-style services of the time.
Absolutely right, if I may just butt in again, because a blacksmith, of all things, needs a very, very skilled apprentice. This is not your goat herd. This is a skilled worker.
Okay, so while Balian is working, one of Godfrey's knights comes into the shop and sits there talking to Balian while eating something. The knight wipes his face with his hair. I am almost certain this is not accurate. The only point of this, again, is Scott's incessant screaming at the viewer that the West was backward. Also, this knight wears his hair in braids, which also seems inaccurate.
I call that a gratuitous insult, although we can't prove it was never done by anyone, and there would have been different levels of manners among men of different races and background. This guy's supposed to be a knight, and knights would have generally been more civilized than the average peasant.
Pretty much. The art of being a knight was definitely not limited to the tourney field or preparing for battle. This was a set of manners and prescribed decorum that covered their entire lives and their daily activities.
During Balian and this knight's conversation, the knight asks Balian where he experienced war. Balian says, in a fight between one lord against another, because of a point which can no longer be remembered. Now, I'm not sure how a blacksmith like Balian's character in this movie would have remembered a conflict like this. What do you think, Helena?
This is supposed to be France, although it was filmed in Spain, by the way, and it is a period in which the Plantagenets were quarreling incessantly among themselves and using most of France as their battleground. So Henry II's sons formed alliances, sometimes fighting together, sometimes fighting against each other, almost always fighting against their father, which of course was not generally approved of. And in all of this fighting, they were highly dependent on mercenaries. Because, as I say, your frugal levies just only fought for 40 days. So what we have here is a typical situation where the mercenaries really wouldn't have cared who they were fighting for or what cause they were fighting for. They were going to change sides at a drop of a hat based on who was paying the most. So in a sense, Balian is speaking in this scene like a mercenary.
Yep. And since this is France, we should remember one thing. France's level of centralization was minimal at best until after the 100 Years' War. By and large, at this juncture, vast swathes of French territory, certainly with the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II, much, if not most, of the French countryside pledged fealty to the English crown rather than the French crown. So border disputes would have been fairly common, and Balian's mercenary outlook would have been common for the average person. The average peasant didn't really care so much for who ruled as long as they were left alone. And we see this later throughout the major conflicts, like in the 100 Years' War. The English take a city, and the populace greets them with open arms. When the French take it back, they again are greeted with open arms. The loyalty of the average peasant is to peace. Peace meant prosperity, and war had this tendency to disrupt that.
Okay, so during this same scene, the same knight, who I believe we find out later is German, points to the motto inscribed in Latin over Balian's workshop and asks, "What does that say?" Balian says, "What man is a man who doesn't make the world better?" I really have no idea where this quotation comes from. Does this seem like a motto that would have been held by someone like Balian, Helena?
I'm going to say, as a novelist, I have to defend Scott here. We all use specific settings and plots in order to tell our own story. There's always a degree of tension between the period in which the work is set and the period in which it's written. I would argue that most works of fiction tell you much more about the author's society than the characters. Unlike other aspects of this film, such as the health and wealth of the peasants or the jihadist nature of Saladin, this is something that isn't flat out wrong, even if it may be improbable.
Yeah, I'm going to come out here with a plausible explanation. Hillel the Elder, who's a prominent Jewish philosopher, once stated, "If I am not for myself, who is for me? And being for my own self, what am I? And if not now, when?" This is not only such a quote that is certainly prevalent by the 12th century. I mean, Hillel the Elder dies around 10 AD, but numerous saints and learned doctors of the church would have expressed similar ideas of building the kingdom of God on earth. I certainly would have appreciated a bit more of a direct quote for the saying, but Balian is well within the realm of probability for having an attitude of working to make the world a better place.
All right, next there is a scene where Godfrey of Ibelin meets Balian. Godfrey then reveals to Balian that he is in fact his father, but that he left him to be raised in the village because he had conceived Balian illegitimately with a peasant woman. Godfrey's revelation of himself as Balian's father seems funny to me. Bastards were commonplace in the medieval world, and lords would usually provide for them. Why was Godfrey so secretive about his bastard?
As you hit, I think the bigger problem here is that the issue is that Balian was never a bastard. He's a historical character, and he was his father's third son by a noble and wealthy lady, the heiress of Ramla. Furthermore, Balian wasn't raised in the West, much less as a blacksmith. He was raised in the kingdom of Jerusalem as the son of a baron, enjoying all of the privileges, education, and training that went with that status. He was of noble birth and station from the day he was born, and he wasn't a blacksmith or a bastard.
Yep. This is Scott's fabrication for storytelling purposes. When the end of the movie comes and Balian wanders back to France with nothing to show for his journey except his experience and his new bride, it's supposed to be a good setup for him to be jaded by the Crusade experience. And I'll say just one other thing with this. Godfrey, you mentioned that bastards were pretty commonplace and they were provided for usually. We even have, in the English language at least, a specific moniker that gets appended to the last name of the person to indicate that they were a bastard son, and that's the moniker Fitz. So if you know a Fitzgibbon, or particularly a Fitzroy, Fitzroy was the bastard son of a king. So at some point, the king was where he shouldn't have been at night.
Okay, in the next scene, Godfrey offers Balian to come with him to the Holy Land to be his heir at Ibelin. Balian refuses. After Godfrey departs with his entourage, Balian discovers that this evil priest from earlier in the film stole his wife's cross necklace and had the corpse of her head cut off. Furious, Balian violently murders the priest, then flees his village. Balian rides all night to catch up with Godfrey and his men in the woods. Balian asks Godfrey, "Is it true that if I go to Jerusalem, I can erase my sins and those of my wife?" Balian's question here does seem almost like it might reference the indulgence earned by participants in a crusade. How accurate does Balian's question seem to the two of you? Is this how a 12th century blacksmith would have conceived of the forgiveness he could get in Jerusalem?
I think probably yes, because we're getting to the theological distinctions, which maybe Paul can elaborate a little bit on, would not have been, familiar to everybody. As I say, this Balian being a blacksmith and not as he really would have been a nobleman with any background in theology. And I also would point out people did pray for the souls of others. That's what all those masses for the dead and chantry chapels were about. So I think this could be considered accurate.
Absolutely. Part of the church's inducement for going to Jerusalem is what's called a plenary indulgence. The indulgence we're familiar with today is buying a ticket to heaven from Johann Tetzel in the Reformation, but indulgences are meant to be something else entirely. According to the church, in order to achieve forgiveness for our sins through the sacrament of reconciliation, we must first repent our sins and then ask for that forgiveness. And usually the priest will then offer a small penance, which is an outward act of contrition to be taken up by the penitent. It is, in essence, proof that you're reformed. Usually it's something to do with the sin you committed. So, for example, if your sin was assaulting someone, you may be asked to volunteer at a hospital. This continues to this very day. A plenary indulgence is where a pope or a bishop offers the absolution of sins upon completion of the penitent act without actually requiring the confession itself. So in the First Crusade, the plenary indulgence was offered to those who went on crusade and to those who completed a pilgrimage to a holy shrine. Of course, the best place to go is Jerusalem, but the safer places in the West would be to go to Rome or to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Catholics still offer this today. In 2013, I had two friends of mine fly to France, and they walked the Camino, which is the traditional pilgrim's path in France, over the border into Spain, and they earned a plenary indulgence by praying at the shrine and attending a mass there. So this is one area where Scott is on point and completely accurate.
So after Balian sets out with Godfrey, they stop in the woods to camp. Now, one of the men in Godfrey's entourage is this black Muslim who, we as the audience infer, is a native of the East and must have joined Godfrey during his time in the Holy Land. There is a scene where one of Godfrey's men urinates in the river upstream, and this black Muslim berates him and stops him. Again, this is just Scott trying to insist once more that Western Europeans were stupid and Muslims were smart. The Muslim obviously understands that you don't urinate upstream from your camp, and of course the stupid Westerner doesn't get that. But my guess is that everyone in the Middle Ages knew this.
I would agree 100%. I think one of the common misconceptions about the Middle Ages is that people didn't bathe and were fundamentally unhygienic. In fact, we know that there were more bathhouses and bathing was more common in the Middle Ages than after the Renaissance, because the Puritan Calvinist preachers saw bathhouses as morally corrupting because men and women sometimes bathed together. So after the Reformation, bathhouses disappeared and hygiene deteriorated dramatically across Europe. By the 18th century, even royalty was smelling and flea-infested. But that was not true in the Middle Ages. In the 12th century, precisely because bathing was more difficult without hot and cold, electrically pumped water in every home, it was more highly valued. It was considered a luxury, and it was considered something, as I say, valuable. Likewise, because it was more likely for ordinary people to wash in a river or lake, they would have been very familiar with how to keep their own water as clean as possible.
Indeed, and one of the few surviving writings of the Western Roman Empire was Vegetius's De Re Militari, which gives explicit instructions on how to maintain an army, including how to dig latrines, where to dig them, to keep the fresh water and the sewage apart from one another. So while the medieval knight may not have known everything about sanitation in a modern sense, they certainly would have known about battlefield sanitation.
Also, while hanging out in their camp at the woods, Godfrey takes it upon himself to school his blacksmith son Balian in the arts of hand-to-hand combat. Godfrey trains Balian to use a sword, but he trains him in just the use of a sword, not with a sword and shield. This seems odd considering how closely these two weapons were associated for medieval knights. The reason these two weapons were always paired together seems emphasized when Godfrey says, "Here, take a high guard, like this," raising the sword above his head, leaving his entire midsection exposed to attack.
The other problem with the scene is that Godfrey is using a two-handed sword, which was not normal at this time. The average sword of this period was less than 3 feet long and was used one-handed so that the other could hold the shield. So not until the 15th century that swords developed into the two-handed 5-foot swords that you'll see like in the Wars of the Roses. And it was also not until the 15th century that shields got largely disappeared from the battlefield.
Yep, indeed. The shield wall was still a pretty impressive formation at this time, and on the ground you always wanted to fight with a shield if you were wielding a sword. Even on horseback, if you throw away the shattered lance and draw your sword, you want that free hand guiding your mount through the battle to ensure you aren't dragged down or cornered by spear and pike-wielding peasants. The mobility and power of a good warhorse becomes a weapon in and of itself, and that's the way cavalry stays throughout the historical record until and even after the development of tanks. As a noble, which Balian was born to, as Dr. Schrader astutely points out, this is how he would have trained.
Just one little point to that, Paul, just a second, because the knight actually relied almost entirely on his legs and weight during mounted combat. He held his shield on his left arm, so even mounted, he was using that shield. And when fighting on horseback, that shield is a weapon as much as a defensive, as much as protection, because you can knock other riders off their horses with your shield, particularly if you and your horse are both bigger and stronger than your opponents, as was the case with the Crusaders.
Indeed.
All right, in the next scene, a posse of knights from the castle of Godfrey's brother comes looking for Balian, intent on arresting him for the murder of the priest. The posse is in fact led by the son of Godfrey's brother. When Godfrey's nephew asks for Balian, Godfrey refuses, and a brawl ensues. After the fight, Godfrey has a captive, a knight who explains that he is some baron's son and should be accorded the privilege of ransom. Godfrey laughs this off and then allows one of his men to slaughter the prisoner. Again, we've got a supposedly medieval character, Godfrey of Ibelin, who shows absolutely no medieval mentality. A medieval knight would have taken the legal proceedings of ransom very seriously. This was a part of chivalry. But of course, Godfrey is a cynical postmodern nihilist who views the whole of medieval Christian civilization as a hypocritical fraud, an attitude totally out of place in the 12th century. What do you think, Helena?
Absolutely. So ransoms were an important feature not only of Western medieval warfare, but of Eastern warfare as well. So important, in fact, that the promise not to offer a ransom was a radical statement of commitment by a medieval leader. See Henry V's, Shakespeare's Henry V, where he comes and says, "Come thou no more for ransom, gentle-haired, they shall have none, I swear, but these my joints, which if they have, as I will leave in them, shall yield them little." That's a statement. I am so determined to fight this to the end. I'm not going to accept ransom. That's not the same thing as saying I won't give ransom. The size of a ransom also reflected on the status or value of the man captured. The fact that Saladin demanded 200,000 gold bezants for the Baron of Ramla in 1180 a sum greater than the Saracens had demanded for the ransom of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem half a century earlier. Tells us, for example, that Saladin believed Ramla was destined to be the next king of Jerusalem, i.e. that he expected Ramla to marry the then widowed Princess Sibylla. In the Hundred Years' War, by the way, Paul, maybe you heard this as well, the English took to letting their French captives name their own ransom because the French were more concerned about showing their worth than saving their relatives, any expense. Killing someone who offered a ransom would be considered bad form, as I say, unchivalrous, but also bad business. And medieval man was rarely both lacking in self-interest and honor at the same time. I guess you could say, however, that Scott didn't want his characters delayed by ransom negotiation, which is fair enough in terms of, plot. But having Godfrey kill a captive is gratuitous violence intended to reinforce this theme of the 12th century knights being barbarous and merciless. And I find it particularly disturbing that it's the otherwise sympathetically portrayed Godfrey, not someone like Renaud de Chatillon, who commits this outrage.
Yeah, this is definitely Scott's Hollywood interfering with history again. And as you point out with the Hundred Years' War, they certainly allowed the French prisoners to name their own ransoms. And it was good business sense to allow these ransoms to be paid, because when you have to raise an army, you otherwise have to raise taxes or take out loans from people like the church or various wealthy merchants, and loans have to be paid back. Ransoms don't. In fact, at one point, ransoms are just a better part of history than violence. One point, Richard I is actually captured on his way home from the Crusades and held for ransom by Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire. It becomes a bit of a race to see who could raise money faster. Richard's brother John of England or Philip II of France, both of whom basically wanted to secure his release so that they could kill him. Philip II and Richard both fell out very badly with one another in Outremer, and John, of course, wanted the throne. We've mentioned it several times thus far, the attitude of postmodern nihilism that seems to infect the Crusaders with this blasé sense of hypocrisy about going on crusade. It's definitely historically out of place. There's really no reason at all for Christians to be cynical or skeptical about this. One of the four reputed lances of Longinus, one of those relics, is found on the First Crusade in 1098 during the Siege of Antioch. Peter Bartholomew receives a vision leading him to uncover this holy lance, and the inspirational boost to morale presented by this rather dubious divine intervention affords the Christian defenders the rally they needed to break the siege and send the Muslims running. There's really no reason whatsoever for a cynical or hypocritical view of the crusade ideal when it's riding the waves of these military successes, complete with divine signs and miracles. Much of what happened can be likened to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge with Constantine, where God comes in and blesses the troops before an impossible battle and hands over a stunning military victory to the true believers. So Christian crusaders at this point would have had a real cementing of the power of God and the supporting that notion that the campaign itself had the blessings of divine providence.
I mean, I don't know, Steve, maybe you know, what date does Scott lead with? Does he tell us what year this film is supposed to start in?
Yeah, the opening scene where it shows that text, it says France, 1184.
84. Okay, so it would have been after the victory at Montgassard, is what I'm trying to get at, where the Crusaders had totally defeated, had destroyed Saladin's invading army and sent him escaping on the back of a pack camel. So this is exactly what Paul's saying. At this point in time, the Crusaders would have been feeling like they had God very much on their side. In fact, they felt that even after the defeat of Hattin. They felt that they had sinned and that had caused the defeat, but they never actually doubted whether they had God on their side.
Well, that concludes the first part of our analysis of Kingdom of Heaven. Again, Helena, Paul, I really appreciate both of you contributing your expertise to this discussion. And Helena, I understand you have a new website.
I've just launched a new website, actually, and it's called Defender of Jerusalem, all one word. So it's defenderofjerusalem.com. And I've got it organized around, of course, it's about the Kingdom of Jerusalem and about Balian and it's organized by theme. So you can either look up things like arts or the economy, or you can look at defending the Crusader kingdoms and find out about various battles like Montgesard or Hattin or the Crusader castles. Anyway, www.defenderofjerusalem.com.
Yeah, and Helena's new site is truly outstanding. I know we've published some pieces from it on the Real Crusades History Facebook page, so do check that out. She's got a lot of good stuff on there. And Paul, you don't have a website, do you?
No, I'm firmly stuck in the 19th century of print, even though print is dead. I'm currently working on some articles for Medieval Warfare magazine, so as soon as I have some sort of publication date, I will let you guys know.
Or yes, we can certainly link them on our website, both of us.
Sounds great.
Well, do keep us abreast of that, please. So anyway, thanks again for joining us today, everybody, for our analysis of the movie Kingdom of Heaven. Please join us again next Monday evening, right here on the Real Crusades History YouTube channel. And you can catch part 2 of our analysis. Until then, thanks.